Hi, and welcome back. Today, I'd like to talk about voltage-controlled LFOs. If you're somewhat new to modular or you come from using synthesizers that don't offer voltage control over their LFOs, you might miss out on a lot of fun. Static LFOs definitely have their uses, but being able to control the speed of an LFO with other voltages opens up a lot of possibilities. I'm using the MFB Dual LFO a lot in this video, so I'll quickly go over its features before we dive into some patch ideas. If you'd like to support this video series, or you'd like to get access to PDF sheets of the illustrations I use in this and many of my other videos, have a look at my Patreon. But now, let's dive right in. This is the MFB Dual LFO. It's a simple module with two independent LFOs. Each of the LFOs has a switch to set the output shape, each offering a slightly different set. The first one has saw, triangle and square. The second offers ramp, triangle and a stepped random voltage, making it pretty versatile. Beside the single output, there's a control voltage input and a reset for each LFO. The second LFO also has a switch to set it in one-shot mode, so when it receives a trigger in the reset, it just fires off once. The CV inputs come with a pretty essential attenuator, so it's easy to set the amount of modulation. And of course there's a knob to set the base frequency. A nice thing on this module is that the CV input of each LFO is internally connected to the other LFO. So without any patching, you can open up the attenuator of one of the LFOs to be influenced by the other, making it easy to introduce cross-modulation. That internal connection is broken when you patch in an external control voltage. It's a simple module with infinite possibilities within a modular system. I don't think this particular module is in production anymore, but the tricks in this video will work with any voltage controllable LFO. In contrast with static modulation, LFOs with some modulation from another LFO offer more interesting shapes and patterns. This is a great way to keep modulation more interesting over a longer period of time. Let's start with a simple drone patch. Here we use two oscillators, a mixer to mix them together and a single filter to shape the drone. At the end I use a VCA to control the volume, but it's opened all the time to create a constant drone. Now if we add the MFB's two LFOs, illustrated by two individual blocks here, we can send the output of one of them to the filter, but instead of having that LFO run steady, we introduce some modulation from one to the other to create more dynamic movement. Because there's two of them, we can exploit that to create even more complex sounds. Of course, you can send the LFOs to any parameter you want. Within a drone, you could try things like wave folders, delay time and reverb amount, for example. But let's have the second LFO influence the pitch of one of the oscillators. Just a little bit to create some noticeable oscillator drifting. And if we want, we can even introduce some cross-modulation between the two LFOs. The same concept works to create motion in shorter melodic notes as well. Let's make our drone patch a little more complex. If we would introduce a simple envelope to control the filter and VCA, and we use a sequencer to trigger that envelope, and send the oscillators a 1 volt per octave signal, we can create a sequence with more distinct notes. Now let's use one LFO on a filter again, but send the other to a VCA, controlling the amount of frequency modulation between oscillator 1 and 2. This is a simple way to keep the 8-step sequence a lot more dynamic. Instead of using LFOs to create slow dynamic changes, we can also use them at audio rates to create subtle textures and sounds. For example, we can use one LFO at audio rates to subtly influence the filter. But instead of it running steady, we use a slowly changing smooth random voltage to have the speed of the LFO drift a bit over time. Or, instead of a random source, we can use a CV sequencer to program a sequence to set the speed of the LFO, creating rhythmic modulation. This simple concept can be used on pretty much anything within your modular to create dynamic patches. But let's look at some other uses. If you're working fully within a modular, an LFO can be a perfect clock source. Quite often you might like a simple static clock, but for more ambient or self-generative patches, a fluctuating clock can bring your patch to life. If you take the square output of the first LFO, it can function as a gate. Send it to a clock divider and you set up a steady clock with multiple divisions to integrate in your patch. If you introduce a second LFO and some cross-modulation between the two, you can set that clock to anything from steady to slightly drifting to quite chaotic. Here is that effect on a more complex ambient patch with multiple voices and percussive sounds. Of course, you don't have to go this crazy. You can also just use a single LFO and send it a signal every now and then to make little jumps or temporarily speed it up or down. For example, have the random output from the second LFO trigger a simple envelope that speeds up the clock every now and then. Or, if you like to have the clock slow down, invert that signal before going to the LFO. You can also use the clock divisions created by the clock itself to trigger that envelope. For example, use two different divisions, each triggering their own envelope, both influencing the core clock speed. One with a positive effect, the other with an inverted effect. You can experiment with these setups to find interesting tempo fluctuations that work for your patch. Of course, you don't have to use this concept as your master clock. You can also use it on a single voice, floating through an otherwise static patch. Or to create dynamics in a single percussive part, for example. Let's use a steady 16-step trigger pattern from a sequencer to reset the square LFO. If we manually set the LFO speed right, the rising edge of the square LFO matches our tempo and can be used to trigger a hi-hat module, for example. Now, if we use the random out from the second LFO to trigger an envelope again and send that to speed up the LFO, we create random sped up bursts of triggers in between steady triggers. So far we used our LFOs to create more chaotic elements in our patches. But we can also use them in a very controlled way to add texture to single tonal or percussive sounds. Let's take our simple voice again. One oscillator through a filter and a VCA. We use the sequencer of the BeatStep Pro to send the oscillator a 1 volt per octave signal. And to gate an attack hold release envelope going to both the filter and the VCA, so we can play our voice and create longer sounds. Now, let's use one LFO to influence the filter, but instead of it running steady, we multiply the BeatStep Pro's gate output to another envelope with a short attack and slightly longer decay time. Then we send that envelope to influence the LFO speed. Now, we can set our LFO to a speed that we like, but every time we start playing a note, it starts off a lot faster and then quickly slows down, creating an interesting transient to the sound, especially if we have it speed up to audio rates. You can expand on this simple principle and make it as complex as you like. For example, we can change our setup a bit by sending the LFO to the input of a VCA before going to the oscillator's linear FM input. Then we multiply the envelope going to the LFO and send it to open that VCA. This way, the envelope speeds up the LFO as well as determines the amount of FM the LFO has on the oscillator. starting with a lot and then quickly slowing down and fading out. To incorporate another idea, let's trigger a third envelope with another copy of our gate signal, this time with a slow rising attack and some release. And let's send that envelope to another LFO, again having it speed up. We then send the LFO to open a VCA that we feed some white noise as audio. The result goes to another VCA, which in turn is opened by the same rising envelope. Finally, that is mixed with our synth voice. This way, if we hold a note for a longer time, we introduce a slowly rising amount of noise created by a slowly faster going LFO. Of course, you can experiment as much with envelope shape and destinations as you like, but creating multiple time-based effects on a single voice can add a lot of character to your sound. In a modular, you can use control voltages to do pretty much anything, and the more flexibility and control you have over them, the more creative your sounds and patches can be. I hope this gave you some new ideas. If you have more tips to share, let us know in the comments. Also, smash that like and subscribe button if you want to see more videos like this. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.